20 years of service. Margaret Chen had worked at Henderson Technologies for 20 years. She started as a junior accountant at 35, when her children were small and her husband Richard was climbing his own corporate ladder. Now, at 55, she was the company's chief financial officer. She knew every number, every contract, every secret the company held. She'd saved Henderson Technologies 3 times from financial disaster. She'd restructured debt, negotiated acquisitions, and built systems that made the company profitable. But her husband had stopped seeing her years ago. Richard was vice president of operations, a position he'd earned partly through Margaret's mentorship early in their marriage, though he'd forgotten that detail. These days he saw her as competition, as someone who made him look less impressive by comparison, and lately he'd been seeing someone else. A 28-year-old marketing assistant named Ashley. Margaret knew. She'd known for 6 months. She'd seen the texts, the late meetings, the way Richard looked at this young woman with something Margaret hadn't seen in his eyes for a decade. The morning everything changed. Margaret arrived at the office early, as always. She had a meeting scheduled with the board at 10, an important meeting, one she'd been preparing for quietly for months. Richard was already there, which was unusual. He was in the conference room with Ashley and 2 other junior executives. When Margaret walked past, Richard called out, "Margaret, can you come in here for a moment?" She stepped inside, confused. This wasn't a scheduled meeting. Richard stood, his posture stiff and formal. "Margaret, I've made a difficult decision. We're restructuring the finance department. Your position is being eliminated. We're moving in a different direction, someone younger with fresh ideas and energy." Margaret stared at him. "You're firing me." "I'm eliminating your position," Richard corrected. "It's a business decision. Nothing personal." Ashley sat at the table, trying to look professional but failing to hide a small, satisfied smile. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. Not anger, not yet. Just a profound clarity. "I see," she said calmly. "And who will be taking over my responsibilities?" "We'll be distributing them among the team," Richard said. "Ashley will be handling strategic finance. She has wonderful ideas about modernizing our approach." Ashley, who had an undergraduate degree in marketing and had been with the company for 8 months. "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "I'll need to schedule an exit meeting with HR and the board." "That won't be necessary," Richard said quickly. "I'm handling this at the executive level. You can pack your things today. We'll provide 2 weeks severance, 2 weeks, after 20 years. The board meeting. At exactly 10 o'clock, Margaret walked into the boardroom. Richard wasn't there. He hadn't been invited to this particular meeting. The board members looked up as she entered. Thomas Henderson, the elderly founder, smiled warmly from the head of the table. "Margaret," he said, "please sit down. We have important matters to discuss." Margaret took her seat, her expression neutral. Thomas looked around the table. "As you all know, I'm retiring. At 83, it's time. I've spent the last year evaluating who should take ownership of this company, who understands it, who saved it repeatedly, who has the wisdom and integrity to lead it forward." He paused, looking directly at Margaret. 6 months ago, I approached Margaret privately. I offered to sell her controlling interest in Henderson Technologies. She accepted. The paperwork was finalized yesterday. As of 9 this morning, Margaret Chen owns 51% of this company. The board members nodded. They'd all known. They'd all supported it. "Margaret," Thomas continued, "the company is yours. What are your first orders as majority owner?" Margaret took a slow breath. "First, I'd like to address a personnel matter that occurred this morning. The reckoning." Richard was called to the boardroom 30 minutes later. He walked in confidently, assuming he'd been invited to discuss the restructuring. Then he saw Margaret sitting at the head of the table. "Richard," she said calmly, "please sit down." He sat, confused. "What's going on? Why is everyone here?" "I've just become majority owner of Henderson Technologies," Margaret said evenly. "Mr. Henderson sold me controlling interest. The transaction finalized yesterday." Richard's face went pale. "This morning," Margaret continued, "you fired me. You eliminated my position to make room for someone with fresh ideas and energy. Someone younger. Someone you're having an affair with. Richard started to protest, but Margaret raised her hand. I'm not interested in your explanations. What I'm interested in is this. You've been embezzling from the company for the past 14 months. Small amounts. Carefully hidden. But I'm the CFO, Richard. I see everything. She slid a folder across the table. Here's the evidence. You've taken approximately $200,000 through falsified expense reports and ghost contractors. I've documented every transaction. Richard's hand shook as he opened the folder. You have two choices, Margaret said. You can resign immediately, sign an agreement to repay every penny and leave quietly. Or I can press charges and you can explain to a judge and to our children why you stole from the company your wife built while you were busy having an affair. The room was silent. I'll resign, Richard whispered. Good choice, Margaret said. HR will have the paperwork ready in an hour. You'll leave today. And Richard? Her voice softened slightly, not with affection but with something like pity. I hope Ashley was worth it. I hope she makes you happy, because you've just lost everything else. The aftermath. Ashley was quietly let go the following week, not for the affair but for gross incompetence. It turned out she'd been making expensive mistakes that Margaret had been quietly fixing for months. Margaret stood in her new office, the corner office that had belonged to Thomas Henderson, and looked out over the city. Her assistant knocked. Mrs. Chen? Your 2 o'clock is here. Thank you, Patricia. Send them in. Margaret had spent the afternoon interviewing candidates for vice president of operations. She was looking for someone competent, someone ethical, someone who understood that respect wasn't given based on age or gender, but earned through integrity and skill. That evening, Margaret called her children, both in their 20s now, both aware of their father's affair, and told them what had happened. I'm sorry you had to do that. Mom, her daughter said. I'm not, Margaret replied honestly. For 20 years I made myself smaller to make your father feel bigger. I deferred to him, supported him, built him up, and he repaid that by dismissing me, by choosing someone younger and less threatening. She paused. But the truth is I was never less than him. I was just quieter about my power. Now I don't have to be quiet anymore. 6 months later. Henderson Technologies, now officially Chen Technologies, was thriving. Margaret had restructured operations, brought in new talent, and increased profitability by 30%. She'd also started a mentorship program for women in finance. She gave talks about recognizing your own worth, about not dimming your light for anyone. One afternoon, she received an email from Richard. He'd moved to another state, was working in a mid-level position, and was apparently no longer with Ashley. The email was long, apologetic. He claimed he'd been going through a crisis, that he'd made terrible mistakes, that he was sorry. Margaret read it once, then deleted it. She'd learned something important. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. She could release her anger without giving him access to her life again. Some bridges burn for a reason, and sometimes the fire clears the way for something better. The real victory. Standing in her office on a quiet Friday evening, Margaret reflected on the journey. Not the dramatic firing or the revelation or even the takeover, but the quiet moment months earlier when Thomas Henderson had approached her. Margaret, he'd said, I've watched you build this company while your husband took credit. I've watched you save us while he grandstanded. Would you like to own it? She'd said yes, not for revenge, not to hurt Richard, but because she'd finally understood something crucial. She didn't need anyone's permission to claim what she'd earned. The company was hers because she'd built it. The respect was hers because she'd earned it. The power was hers because she'd never actually given it away. She'd just stopped announcing it. And that, Margaret understood, was the real lesson. Not that she'd defeated Richard, but that she'd finally stopped defeating herself. The end. Friends, sometimes we spend years making ourselves smaller so others can feel bigger. We dim our lights. We soften our voices. We apologize for our competence. But here's the truth. Your power doesn't threaten the right people. And the ones it does threaten, they were never truly in your corner to begin with. Own what you've built. Claim what you've earned. And never apologize for being exactly as capable as you are.